The paper was still warm from the printer when the bank manager slid it across the desk to me. I remember that detail, specifically the faint heat of it against my fingertips, the way the edges were perfectly straight, the way the font was so clean and official, and completely indifferent to what it was telling me. I had come in that Tuesday morning wearing my good blazer, the charcoal one I saved for things that mattered, because withdrawing $3,500 for a graduate school deposit felt like an occasion worth dressing for. I had rehearsed the transaction in my head during the drive over. Walk in, show ID, complete the withdrawal form, walk out. 11 minutes, maybe 12. I had been sitting in that chair for 40. The number on the statement was $0. Not low, not reduced, not the result of some processing error I could laugh about later with the teller, while she reversed the charge and handed me a receipt. 0, a perfect, absolute, administratively confirmed 0. Sitting in the balance column where $47,000 had been the last time I checked, which I now realized with a nauseating drop in my stomach had been almost 3 years ago, because I had trusted it was safe. Because I had been told it was safe. Because the whole point of a trust account was that it was structured precisely so that a 26-year-old woman trying to build a life could leave it alone and know it would be there when she needed it. I need you to understand something about me before we go any further, because I think it matters for everything that comes after. I am not a dramatic person. I was raised, very deliberately, to be the opposite of dramatic. In my family, composure was the currency of worthiness. If you cried, you were sensitive. If you pushed back, you were difficult. If you asked too many questions, you were ungrateful. I had spent 26 years becoming fluent in stillness. So when the number registered, when my brain processed what my eyes were reading, I did not make a sound. My hands stayed flat on the table. I did not lean forward or backward. I simply sat there while the room did something strange, tilted, almost imperceptibly, like a ship adjusting its weight, and the bank manager's voice, which was explaining something about withdrawal history and authorized signatories, came to me through what I can only describe as several inches of water, muffled, slowed, as though the air between us had thickened. "Miss Reyes," he said, and I heard my name from a distance. "The account activity shows a series of authorized withdrawals." The co-signatory on the account executed 21 separate transactions beginning approximately 38 months ago. Co-signatory. I knew, before he finished the sentence, whose name was on that line. I knew the way you know something your body understood, before your mind gave it permission, a cold, immediate, cellular certainty. My father had been added as a co-signatory when the account was opened, when I was 18, and my grandmother had set it up, and my parents had been present, and my father had signed documents at a table very much like this one. It had been practical, she'd said. Administrative. In case something needed managing before I turned 21, I was 26. Nothing had needed managing. Except, apparently, it had. "Can I see the transaction history?" I asked. My voice was level. It surprised me. The manager printed a second document, 12 pages, single-spaced. The withdrawals were listed in clean rows, dates, amounts, authorization codes, and they ranged from $800 to $6,200, and they were spaced out carefully, never too close together, never large enough individually to trigger an automatic alert, as though someone had thought about how to do this without creating noise. 3 years of quiet, methodical emptying. The last transaction was 14 months ago. The account had been sitting at 0 for over a year while I was out living my life, finishing my undergraduate thesis, applying to graduate programs, planning a future on a foundation that had already been demolished. I thanked the bank manager. I folded both documents and put them in my bag. I walked out through the glass doors and across the parking lot, and I got into my car and I closed the door and I sat there. Let me tell you about my family, because you need the map to understand the territory. My parents immigrated from the Philippines before I was born, and they built a life here through a combination of genuine sacrifice and a value system that, over time, calcified into something much harder to examine. My brother Marcus is 4 years older than me. He was the firstborn son, and in the architecture of our household, that meant something specific and structural. His name was spoken at the dinner table like a promise the family was collectively keeping, a future the entire unit was oriented toward. He graduated, and my parents cried. He got promoted, and my parents called their friends. He got engaged, and my parents began talking about the wedding the way other people talk about a coronation. My name, in contrast, was spoken the way you mention a piece of furniture you're fond of but don't think about much. I graduated summa laude from a program that cost me 3 years of double shifts and academic pressure. I never once complained about, and my parents sent a card. A card with a $20 bill inside it, because they had already booked flights to attend Marcus's company retreat that same weekend. I am not telling you this to perform bitterness. I am telling you because the pattern matters. The pattern is the story. My grandmother Nadia understood the pattern. She was my father's mother, which meant she had watched the same dynamic operate across 2 generations, and she had drawn her own conclusions. When I was 18, she called me into her kitchen, that kitchen that always smelled of rice vinegar and the particular floral soap she ordered from a specialty shop, and she sat across from me at her small table, and she told me she was going to do something for me. Not give me something. Do something for me. The distinction, she said, was important. She had established a savings trust in my name exclusively, funded with money she had saved independently over 40 years, and she had structured it with an estate attorney so that it was mine in a way that was not symbolic but legal. $47,000. Enough, she said, for whatever I decided my life required. She mailed me the documents 2 weeks later with a note in her handwriting on pale blue stationery. This is yours. Know what that means. I had read it as love. I had filed the documents in a folder in my desk drawer, confirmed the account balance once at 21, and not touched them since, because I did not want to spend them frivolously, because I was waiting for something that mattered enough. Graduate school mattered enough. The deposit was due in 19 days. I sat in that parking lot for 40 minutes. I watched a woman load groceries into a car 2 spaces over. I watched a young couple walk past holding coffee cups. I watched the clouds move in a direction that seemed purposeful and indifferent simultaneously. At some point I turned the heat on because I had started shaking slightly, not from cold, but from the particular physical response your body produces when it is trying to process something your mind is not yet ready to fully accept. I drove home without the radio on. The silence in the car was not peaceful, it was the kind of silence that has texture, that presses against the inside of your ears. I parked in front of my apartment building, and did not go inside. I sat there the same way I had sat in the bank parking lot, looking at the entrance to my building, thinking about the folder in my desk drawer. Eventually I went upstairs. I did not call my parents. I did not call Marcus. I did not text anyone or open my phone at all. I made tea because my hands needed something to do, and then I didn't drink it. I opened my laptop and pulled the folder from the drawer, the one with the trust documents my grandmother had mailed me 8 years ago, and I spread them across my kitchen table in the light of the single overhead lamp, and I began to read them the way I should have read them when I was 18. Carefully. Completely. I was on page 7, when I found a clause I had skimmed past every previous time I'd looked at this document, written in the kind of compact legal language that is easy to treat as boilerplate when you are 18 and trusting, and have no reason to read fine print because the person who loves you most has already handled everything. The clause referenced, in 2 brief sentences, a secondary instrument. I read those 2 sentences 4 times. Then I went back to the beginning and read the entire document again, more slowly, looking for context I might have missed, trying to understand what my grandmother had built and why she had built it with more than 1 layer. I didn't sleep that night. But for the first time since that warm piece of paper had been placed in my hands that morning, the feeling in my chest was not only dread, it was something quieter and more complicated, the specific sensation of standing at the edge of a door you didn't know existed, your hand not yet on the handle, but your fingers already reaching. There is a difference between knowing something and being able to prove it, and for most of my life, I only had the first one. I knew my family operated on a hierarchy. I knew where I ranked in it. But knowing a thing and documenting it are 2 entirely different acts, and it was not until I sat at my kitchen table the morning after the bank, with the transaction history spread out in front of me, alongside the trust documents, and a legal pad I had started filling with dates and amounts, that I understood what I was actually doing. I was building a case. Not for a courtroom, not yet, but for myself. Because years of being told that your perception is wrong, that you are reading too much into things, that families simply work this way, leaves a specific residue on your ability to trust your own observations. I needed to see the pattern written down before I could let myself believe it was real. So let me show it to you the way I showed it to myself that morning. When Marcus turned 18, my parents bought him a car. A used Honda, nothing extravagant, but solid and reliable, and wrapped symbolically in the understanding that he was being equipped for adulthood. When I turned 18, 8 months later, we are close in age, close enough that the comparison was always right there, always available. I received a card. Inside it, my mother had written, "Proud of our girl," and tucked in a gift card to a bookstore I had stopped shopping at 2 years earlier. I kept that card for a long time. I am not sure why, maybe because I wanted the evidence. When I was accepted to my undergraduate program, I sent an email to the family group chat with my acceptance letter attached, and my father responded with a single thumbs up emoji. When Marcus was promoted to regional manager at his company 3 years later, my parents organized a dinner, tablecloth, good dishes, the aunts were called. My mother made his favorite meal, the lamb dish that takes 4 hours, and my father gave a toast that used the word legacy twice. I sat at that table and ate the lamb and smiled when it seemed appropriate and drove home afterward thinking about the thumbs up emoji, turning it over in my mind, like a stone you keep returning to, because its weight still surprises you. The dinner I remember most clearly, though the one I have returned to more times than any other, happened when I was 20. I had brought home my academic transcript to show them. Straight A's, 2 departmental honors, a research fellowship application I had been selected to advance in. My father looked at it for a moment, nodded once in the way that meant he had registered the information and filed it away, and then he said, and I am going to quote him exactly because some sentences deserve to be kept in their original form. "It's good, Enoch. But daughters marry into someone else's story. Sons carry the name forward. Marcus needs to be positioned correctly. That is where we invest." He said it without cruelty. That is perhaps the most instructive detail. He said it the way you state a fact about weather or geography, something simply true, something that has always been true, something he had never once been asked to interrogate. I did not respond. I had been trained not to. I folded my transcript, put it back in my bag, and excused myself to wash the dishes, because that was the role available to me at that table. My grandmother Nadia was in the living room when I walked past. She was sitting in her chair near the window, the one she always occupied at family dinners, and she was watching me with an expression I did not have language for when I was 20 but understand completely now. It was not pity. It was recognition. She had watched this dynamic operate for decades, from the inside, and she had catalogued every iteration of it with the quiet precision of a woman who knew she could not dismantle the structure from the outside, but had spent a long time identifying where the exits were. Nadia was not a soft woman. I want to be clear about that, because the tendency when writing about grandmothers who leave money to their granddaughters is to render them as warm and diffuse, all aprons, and unconditional comfort. She was not that. She was sharp. She had opinions about everything and delivered them without padding. She kept her financial documents in a locked tin box under her bed, and she was the only person in the family who knew where the key was. And she had been that way for 50 years, because she had learned, through direct experience, what happened to women who let other people manage their paperwork. She had married into a family that had spent 40 years treating her money as communal and her needs as peripheral, and she had reached her late 60s having quietly, methodically rerouted what she could into instruments that were specifically, legally, structurally hers. She extended that methodology to me. I was 16 the first time she explained compound interest to me at her kitchen table, using a yellow legal pad and a hand calculator that was older than I was. I was 17 when she showed me the difference between a joint account and a sole beneficiary designation. And I was 18 when she sat across from me in that kitchen, the one that always held the particular smell of vinegar and the floral soap she special ordered, and she took my face in both hands, which she almost never did, and she said, "Smart girls protect themselves. The world will not do it for you. Let me show you how. She set up the trust 2 months later. She died 14 months after that, a stroke, fast and without warning, which is the only mercy in it. And I grieved her the way you grieve someone who understood you specifically, which is a different and more disorienting grief than the general kind. What I did not know, until I sat with the bank transaction records and a calendar the morning after the bank visit, was that the first withdrawal from my trust account was executed 8 months after her funeral. 8 months. I have sat with that number enough times now that I know its weight precisely. 8 months is not long enough to be coincidence. It is not the gap of someone who forgot about an account and stumbled across it later. 8 months is planning. 8 months is waiting for the grief to settle in the family. Waiting for her absence to stop being the primary topic. Waiting until the practical business of her estate had been resolved and attention had moved elsewhere. 8 months is predatory patience. And when I drew that line on my legal pad, Nadia's death date, then the first withdrawal, something in my chest went very still and very cold. I thought about Marcus's engagement party, which I had attended 11 months after the first withdrawal. It was held at a venue my parents had rented, and I remember the flower installations cascading white orchids, the kind that do not grow locally, the kind that are ordered and transported and handled by specialists. I remember the linens on the tables, ivory and heavy, the kind that are rented not bought. I remember Marcus's fiancée moving through the room in a dress that had clearly been expensive, and my mother catching my eye across the room with an expression of pure, uncomplicated pride. At some point in the evening, her older sister asked who was covering the costs, and my mother said, without hesitation, "We have a family fund. We've been planning." A family fund. I had been standing 6 feet away holding a glass of sparkling water, and I had felt nothing specific at the time, just a vague familiar ache I had long since stopped interrogating. Now I stood in my kitchen replaying that sentence and understanding, with a clarity that was almost physical, that I had been present at the announcement of the crime without recognizing it as one. I called my mother that afternoon. Not my father. I knew that conversation would be managed and redirected before it started. My mother, when cornered privately, had a harder time performing. She answered on the second ring. She sounded normal. I told her I had been to the bank. I told her what the balance said. I told her I had the transaction records. I kept my voice even, which cost me something I don't have a name for yet. There was a pause. Then she said, "Celine." Just my name, the way you say a name when you are preparing to explain rather than deny. She did not tell me it was a mistake. She did not tell me she didn't know. She told me the family had needed to present themselves properly for the wedding. She told me Tuscany had been important to Marcus and to his fiancée's family, and that appearances at that level required real investment. She told me my grandmother, had she been alive, would have wanted Marcus to have this. And then she said the thing I keep returning to, the sentence I have turned over more times than I can count. "You're young, Anik. You can rebuild. Marcus only gets one wedding." I did not respond immediately. I was looking at the trust documents on my table, specifically at the page with the estate attorney's contact information, a firm called Wren Legal, a name I had never called, an attorney I had never spoken to, a resource I had filed away at 18 and never thought to use. I told my mother I had to go. She said, "We'll talk more, okay? As a family." I said okay. I hung up. Then I dialed Wren Legal. The phone rang 3 times before voicemail picked up. I left my name, my number, the name of the trust, and I said that I needed to speak with someone about unauthorized withdrawals from an account established in my name. My voice was steady the entire time. It was only after I set the phone down on the table that I noticed my hands. They were trembling not violently, just a fine, persistent tremor, the kind that comes when a body has been holding something rigid for too long and finally registers the strain. It was the first time since the bank manager had slid that warm paper across the desk to me that my composure had shown anything at all. I looked at my hands for a moment. Then I looked at the attorney's name in the document. Patricia Wren. I had no way of knowing then what that name was going to mean. I had no way of knowing what Patricia already knew, or what she had been holding, or how long she had been waiting for me to call. Patricia Wren called back the following afternoon. I was at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I had stopped drinking an hour earlier, still cold, still untouched, positioned next to the legal pad where I had been adding notes in the margins of things I already knew. I had spent the morning researching estate law in a general, unfocused way, the kind of research you do when you need to feel like you are moving without knowing yet in which direction. When my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number, I answered it before the second ring. Miss Reyes. The voice was measured, unhurried, the voice of someone who had delivered difficult information many times and had learned that pace is a form of care. This is Patricia Wren. You left a message for my office yesterday regarding the Nadia Reyes Family Trust. I confirmed who I was. I started to explain the situation, the bank visit, the zero balance, the withdrawal history, and Patricia let me speak for about 45 seconds before she said something that stopped me entirely. I know, she said. I've been aware of the account activity for some time. Miss Reyes, I was wondering when you'd reach out. Your grandmother told me you would, eventually. I set my pen down. I want to try to describe accurately what happened in my body when I heard that sentence, because I think it matters. It was not the shock of surprise exactly, it was something closer to the sensation of a key turning in a lock you did not know had been installed. Like a door you have been leaning against your whole life suddenly having a mechanism, and someone from the other side quietly engaging it. My grandmother had spoken my name to this woman. My grandmother, who had been dead for nearly 4 years, had anticipated this phone call and had left instructions for it. Patricia did not rush to fill the silence. She waited, which told me something about her. She told you I would call, I finally said. She told me the situation would eventually require it, Patricia said carefully. She was specific about a number of things. I think we should speak in detail, but not over the phone. I'd like you to come into the office. There are documents I want you to see in person, she explained, in measured portions, what she could tell me at that stage. My grandmother had not been naive about the primary trust. She had watched the family's financial dynamics for decades, had seen the way resources were directed and redirected, had understood with the clarity of someone who had lived inside the pattern long enough to map it completely. 18 months before she died, she had taken a specific action. There was a property, a small parcel of land in a county 2 hours from where our family lived that she had purchased quietly in her own name in the late 90s, before her marriage, before children, before any of the family structures that later formed around her. She had never mentioned it. She had paid the taxes on it annually from a private account, and 18 months before she died, she had sold it. The proceeds had gone into a second trust instrument. Separate structure, separate management, no co-signatories, no family disclosure. Patricia's firm had been managing it since its establishment. It had never appeared on any document my parents had access to. Your parents have no knowledge of this trust's existence, Patricia said. That was your grandmother's explicit instruction. I sat very still with that information. My grandmother had built a secret room inside her estate planning, furnished it carefully, locked it against everyone except this attorney and, eventually, me. She had done this while she was still healthy enough to think strategically, while she was watching the family move around her, while she was attending Sunday dinners and holding conversations and appearing, to everyone present, to simply be an aging woman enjoying her remaining years. She had been doing something else entirely. I think about the tin box under her bed. I think about the calculator. I told Patricia I would come to the office. We scheduled it for 4 days out. She had availability sooner, but she suggested the 4-day gap in a way that felt like a recommendation rather than a constraint, and I understood, without her saying so, that she was giving me time to arrive there without being destabilized by everything that would happen in between. She was right to anticipate that. Marcus called the evening of the same day I spoke with Patricia. He did not begin with a greeting. He began with, I need you to tell me what you think you're doing. There is a particular verbal architecture that some people deploy when they feel cornered, and Marcus had always been fluent in it. He moved through the conversation in distinct phases. First, the denial, delivered with such forceful conviction that a younger version of me might have doubted herself. Then the pivot to offense, in which my reaching out to an attorney became an act of aggression against his marriage, his happiness, his future. And then the final and most practiced maneuver, in which he repositioned himself as the wounded party, the brother being attacked by a jealous sister at the most vulnerable moment of his life. He used the word weaponizing twice. He said I was making Nadia's death about myself. He said he had always known, somewhere, that I resented what he had built. I listened to all of it. I said very little. At one point I asked him, simply and without hostility, whether he knew where the wedding funds had come from. He said that wasn't his concern, that our parents had handled it. That I should take it up with them if I had a problem. His fiancée texted me 40 minutes after he hung up. Her message was brief and colder than anything Marcus had said, which, if I am being precise, I found almost more honest for its efficiency. If you pursue this, you will not be welcome in this family. Consider whether that matters to you. I read it twice. I did not respond. I saved the screenshot. My father arrived at my apartment unannounced the following morning, which was a Saturday. He was dressed neatly, which meant he had prepared for this, and he was holding a paper bag from the bakery near my parents' house, the one he had taken Marcus and me to as children on occasional weekend mornings. The bag was a prop, I understood immediately, a signal of normalcy, of paternal warmth, of this is a family conversation, and not a negotiation. He had thought about what to bring. I let him in. I did not take the bag. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had been building my case, and he folded his hands, and he looked at me with an expression that I recognized as sincerity being performed rather than felt. He had worn this expression at difficult family dinners. At the one time I remembered him apologizing to my mother for something I never fully understood. At Marcus's graduation when he gave the toast. It was a look he deployed with genuine craft, and I had spent my entire life receiving it as authentic. He told me the family would make it right. He said he had spoken to Marcus and they had a plan $1,000 a month, directly to me. No attorneys, no legal proceedings, no outside involvement, just family. He said the word family, the way you invoke something sacred, something that supersedes the ordinary rules. I watched him deliver this, and I felt something shift inside me that I can only describe as permanent. Not anger. I want to be clear that it was not hot or reactive. It was the specific, quiet experience of an illusion reaching its end. Like standing in a room you have lived in your entire life and realizing, without drama, that the lighting has always been wrong, that everything you thought you were seeing was approximate, and that now, for the first time, something accurate has been turned on, and the room is not what you understood it to be. My father was not a man who had made a mistake he was correcting. He was a man calculating the minimum required to make a problem disappear, and the problem, I understood now with total clarity, was me. I told him I had already been in contact with an attorney. I told him calmly, and without elaboration. His expression shifted not to guilt, but to calculation, a slight recalibration behind the eyes. He said he hoped I would reconsider. He said these things had a way of damaging relationships that couldn't be repaired. He picked up the bakery bag from the table and left with it, which struck me later as somehow the most revealing detail of the entire visit. Patricia had mentioned, at the close of our phone call, that the secondary trust was larger than I might expect. She had said it carefully, in the tone of someone managing the sequence of a disclosure. She had declined to give me figures. She had said, "Come to the office, see the documents. We will go through everything together." I have been thinking about that phrasing ever since. Larger than you might expect. Not larger than average. Not a reasonable amount. Not something along those lines. Larger than what I, specifically, having known my grandmother, having known the property sale, having had some basis for estimation larger than what I would anticipate. The night before the appointment, I lay in the dark of my bedroom, not sleeping, looking at the ceiling. My phone was face down on the nightstand. I was not reading or listening to anything. I was simply lying there, turning over the handwritten note that I had kept in the same folder as the trust documents for 8 years. This is yours. Know what that means. I had always understood it as an expression of love. A grandmother telling her granddaughter that she was valued, that she deserved a foundation, that someone in the family had seen her clearly. I had held that sentence like a comfort. Lying there in the dark, 3 days after a bank manager had slid a zero-balance statement across a laminate desk, one day after my father had left my apartment carrying a bakery bag he had brought for theater, hours away from walking into an attorney's office to see documents I had not yet read, I began to understand that my grandmother had not written me a sentiment. She had written me instructions. And I was only now, finally, close enough to the full picture to understand what she had actually built. Patricia Wren's office was on the fourth floor of a building that had clearly been something else before it was offices. The ceilings were high, the windows were tall, and the wood paneling along the walls had the slightly uneven character of something original rather than installed. I noticed these details the way you notice things when your body is running slightly ahead of your mind, cataloging the physical environment, because the physical environment is manageable, and what you are about to receive may not be. Her assistant offered me water. I accepted it and did not drink it. Patricia came out to the waiting area herself rather than sending someone, which I noted. She was in her late 50s, trim and precise in her movements, with the kind of professional composure that reads not as cold but as deeply practiced. She shook my hand with both of hers briefly, a gesture that communicated something without naming it, and led me down a short hallway into her office. The room smelled of paper and something faintly botanical, a small arrangement of eucalyptus on the credenza behind her desk, dried rather than fresh, the kind of detail that suggested the space had been considered. Natural light came through the window at an angle that fell across the desk without glare. Everything in the room communicated the same thing. This is a place where consequential things are handled without theater. There was a folder on the desk, cream-colored, thick, with a label on the tab I could not read from my angle. Patricia sat down, and without preamble, without the warm-up language of someone who needs you comfortable before the information arrives, she slid it across the desk toward me. Your grandmother established a second trust instrument, she said. I want you to read the summary page first, and then I'll walk you through the full structure. The summary page was a single sheet. At the top, my name. Below it, the trust designation, a private instrument with a name I didn't recognize, unconnected to the original family trust in any documented way. And below that, in the clean numerical language of a financial statement, the current balance. $91,000. I read the number 3 times. I read it the way you reread something when your brain is convinced your eyes have introduced an error. Then I set the page down on the desk, and I looked at Patricia and I said, very quietly, "This is real." "Completely," she said. "Legally airtight, no co-signatories, no provision for family claim. The account has been under managed investment through this firm for 11 years. Your grandmother's instructions were explicit regarding disclosure. I was not to make contact until one of 2 conditions was met. Either the primary trust account was accessed by an unauthorized party, or you made contact directly. Both conditions," she said, with a precision that felt deliberately unrushed, were met in the same week. I want to try to describe accurately what I felt in that moment, because triumph is not the right word and I will not use it. What I felt was more complicated and more difficult to hold than triumph. There was grief in it, a very specific grief, the kind that surfaces when you understand retrospectively the full dimension of what someone did for you before they died, when they were still sitting across from you at kitchen tables and driving to Sunday dinners and appearing, from the outside, to simply be living. My grandmother had known. She had not hoped, had not suspected, had not worried. She had known with enough certainty to build a legal structure around it, to fund it from an asset she had kept entirely private, to instruct an attorney to hold it for 11 years and wait. She had known what her family would do, and she had built me a door out of the room before they locked it. That is what made me cry. Not the number, not the legal victory of it. The knowledge of what she had seen clearly enough to act on, years in advance, without telling me, without burdening me with the awareness that the people around me were eventually going to demonstrate exactly who they were. She had simply made sure that when they did, I would not be standing on ground they had already eroded. I cried in Patricia's office for perhaps 3 minutes. She did not offer tissue immediately or fill the silence with comfort language. She simply waited, which was the right thing to do, and which told me something about what kind of woman my grandmother had chosen to trust with this. When I was steady again, Patricia outlined my options with the same unhurried precision she had applied to everything else. She presented 3 distinct paths. The first was a civil recovery action against my parents' breach of trust on the primary account, which she assessed as winnable given the documentation, the withdrawal timeline, and the co-signatories' clear pattern of non-emergency access. The second was acceptance of my father's informal repayment arrangement, which she framed neutrally but which we both understood carried the implicit cost of silence and absorption. The third was what she called complete legal separation. I would use the secondary trust as my foundation and step back entirely from the primary account's fate, leaving my parents exposed to whatever civil or legal consequences followed from their own actions without my involvement as the driving complainant. She did not recommend. She presented. I appreciated that more than I can articulate. I told her I needed a few days. She said, of course. I used those days to arrange the family meeting. I drove to my parents' house on a Thursday evening. I had called ahead not to ask permission but to ensure attendance, and I had been specific. I needed Marcus there as well. He came, which told me that my parents had communicated some version of urgency without communicating the full picture, because Marcus arrived with the particular energy of someone expecting to manage a difficult sibling rather than reckon with a legal situation. The dining table was set the way it always was in the evenings. Placemats, the centerpiece my mother had kept there for years, the overhead light at its usual dim setting that my father preferred. I had eaten hundreds of meals at that table. I had absorbed hundreds of conversations at that table in which my position in the family's regard had been confirmed and reconfirmed by what was said and what was not said, and who was asked and who was not asked. I sat down and I put the printed documents on the table. Not dramatically. I did not stand or raise my voice, or wait for a reaction before speaking. I placed the folder flat on the surface in front of me, and I told them, in sequence, what I knew: the primary trust balance, the withdrawal timeline, the 21 transactions, the co-signatory authorization, Patricia's firm, the secondary trust, the balance. My father's face changed in a way that I am going to describe as precisely as I can, because precision matters here. It did not go pale. It went a kind of gray, not the gray of shock, but the gray of someone who has been running a calculation for years and has just watched the final variable resolve in a direction they did not plan for. His jaw did not drop. His expression simply became very still, the way a screen goes dark rather than powers down. My mother began crying almost immediately, and I registered the tears without being moved by them in the way I once would have been, which is itself a form of information about what the preceding weeks had clarified in me. Marcus said, "Are you recording this right now?" I told him I was not. I told him it did not matter whether he believed me. Then I told them about the property. I watched my father's face when I said it, the parcel in the neighboring county, the one he had mentioned at 3 separate Christmas dinners as the asset he expected to come to him eventually, the one he had referenced once as his inheritance, the one he had assumed was simply sitting in my grandmother's estate waiting to be distributed. I told him that Nadia had sold it 18 months before she died. I told him where the proceeds had gone. I told him that she had done it quietly, deliberately, and with full legal documentation, and that the attorney who had executed the transaction had been waiting for 11 years for the conditions of disclosure to be met. He said nothing. He looked at the table. What my father did not say in that moment was more legible than anything he could have spoken. He had built a certain version of his future on an assumption about what he was owed, and the woman he had assumed was simply aging had been, in her final years, methodically redirecting that future toward her granddaughter, because she understood something about the family's tendencies that he had never once examined in himself. My grandmother had not just protected me. She had done it with the one asset he had been waiting for. I gathered my documents. I stood up. Marcus said my name once, the way you say someone's name when you have not yet decided what to say after it. I did not wait for him to decide. I walked to the front door. I opened it. And I closed it behind me, not with force, not with the kind of energy that communicates anger or exit as performance. I pulled it until the latch engaged with a soft, definitive click, the quietest sound I have ever made that meant the most. My car was parked at the curb directly in front of the house. I got in. I sat. The last time I had sat in a parked car unable to go inside, I had been trying to make sense of a zero-balance statement, trying to locate the floor of something that had just given way beneath me. The silence then had been vertiginous, pressing, full of questions I didn't yet have the framework to answer. This silence was entirely different. This was the silence of a completed sentence, of a page turned to find the next one already written, already waiting, in handwriting I recognized. I knew what I was going to do. I knew what came next. And for the first time in a very long time, the future I was driving toward was entirely, legally, structurally mine. 6 months is not a long time. I want to say that plainly before I describe what changed, because I think there is a version of this story where 6 months sounds like enough distance, enough resolution, enough of the clean forward momentum that makes for a satisfying ending. It is not enough. But it is something, and something, I have learned, is worth accounting for accurately. My apartment is different now. Not in its layout or its furniture. I have the same couch, the same secondhand bookcase I carried up 3 flights with a friend 2 years ago, but in its quality of occupancy. I take up more of it. That sounds like a small thing, and I am telling you it is not. There are plants on the windowsill that I water on a regular schedule, not because I particularly wanted plants, but because one afternoon I walked past a nursery and went inside and bought 3 without planning to, and the act of carrying them home and finding space for them felt like a declaration of some kind. My desk is no longer pushed against the wall in the corner the way it was when I first moved in, when I was still living in the spatial grammar of someone who had been taught to minimize her footprint. It is in the center of the room now, facing the window, positioned as though the person who uses it has a right to the light. I enrolled in my graduate program's 2nd year using a portion of the secondary trust. $4,100 in tuition and fees, transferred cleanly. Without the particular anxious mental arithmetic, I had been performing around money for as long as I could remember. The constant background calculation of whether I could afford to want what I wanted. I attended my first seminar of the semester and sat in a chair near the front and contributed to the discussion without first checking whether my contribution would be welcome, which was, I realized on the walk home afterward, a thing I had been doing in rooms for my entire adult life. The legal matters resolved in the way that legal matters sometimes do not with drama, but with paperwork and a negotiated figure and a date on which several signatures were collected, and a chapter was formally, documentarily closed. Patricia sent the civil demand letter to my parents in the 3rd month. They did not contest it. My father's attorney, I found out he had hired one, which told me something about the seriousness with which he had privately assessed his exposure, negotiated the settlement figure down from what Patricia had initially demanded, and Patricia accepted the reduced amount on my explicit instruction, because I was not interested in a prolonged legal battle, and I was not interested in the performance of maximum punishment. I was interested in acknowledgement and completion, and the signed settlement document provided both. Marcus's name appears once in the legal paperwork listed as a recipient of funds originating from an unauthorized trust disbursement. He did not attend the settlement meeting. He has not called me. His fiancée has not texted again. I have not reached out. The absence of contact is mutual, and I have spent enough time examining my feelings about it to tell you that what I feel is not what I expected to feel, which is not relief and not grief exactly, but something that sits between them. The particular emotional weather of a door that has been closed by agreement rather than by force. I want to talk about what healing actually looks like, because I think you deserve the honest version rather than the version that ties cleanly. The first holiday without my family was Thanksgiving. I had been invited. Technically, my mother sent a text in early November that said, simply, "Dinner is at 6 if you want to come," with no acknowledgement of anything that had occurred between us, as though the preceding months were a minor weather event that had passed, and we could simply resume the previous configuration. I did not go. I made dinner for myself, and a friend from my program, a simple meal without particular ceremony, and it was fine, genuinely fine. And also there was a moment around 7 in the evening when my phone was quiet, and I felt the absence of obligation as something almost physical. Not painful, but present. Like the ghost sensation of a weight you have been carrying so long that its removal registers as a kind of bewilderment. I had not understood before how much of my relationship with my family had been structured around vigilance, the checking of tone in text messages, the calibration of how much space I occupied at the table, the habitual smallness I maintained in their presence as a form of relational management. Without them as a daily variable, I found myself noticing the vigilance itself, the way it had become ambient, automatic, and how it was taking time to unlearn. Some mornings I would reach for my phone first thing and feel a faint preparatory tension before I remembered that there was no message from my mother to parse, no carefully worded communication requiring careful decoding. The tension would dissolve. And then I would notice it had been there, and the noticing would take a moment. The crime was not the money. I need you to hear that. If you take anything from this story, the money was the evidence. The crime was years of being told, in 100 ways, both explicit and structural, that my perception was unreliable, that my sense of being diminished was a product of sensitivity rather than reality, that the imbalance I felt and named and was told I was imagining was simply how families worked, and I was wrong to find it wrong. When the bank statement confirmed what I had always known, that I occupied a different category of consideration in my family's accounting than my brother did, it did not only reveal the theft, it retroactively validated every moment I had spent doubting myself. Every dinner where I had swallowed a response and wondered privately if I was being unreasonable. Every phone call where I had managed my own emotions in real time to avoid the designation of difficult. The money was the proof, but what had been stolen was far older and far more intimate than any trust account. I visited Nadia's grave on a Sunday morning in the 5th month. I brought the trust summary document, the single-page version Patricia had given me at our first meeting, not as a symbol exactly, but as a specific object, because I wanted to bring something real rather than something representational. The cemetery was quiet in the particular way of early Sunday mornings. The light still low and lateral, the grass slightly damp. I found her stone without difficulty. I stood there for a moment before I said anything. Then I felt slightly foolish and decided the feeling was irrelevant, and started talking anyway. I told her I had read the documents. I told her I understood now what she had built and why, and that the why was the part that mattered most to me, not the mechanism or the money, but the belief embedded in the construction of it, the belief that this particular granddaughter, this specific woman, was worth the effort of a private property sale, and 11 years of managed investment, and an attorney briefed with careful instructions, and a patience that extended beyond her own death. I told her that the most significant inheritance she had left me was not financial. It was the evidence, structural and legal and permanent, that someone had looked at my future and decided it was worth protecting. I thanked her, not in the way you thank someone for a gift, in the way you thank someone for seeing you accurately, when the people closest to you had a professional interest in not doing so. I folded the document back into my coat pocket and I walked to my car. I pulled out of the cemetery lot onto the main road, and I drove. I did not check my mirrors. Not once. Not for the familiar reflex of monitoring what was behind me, what might be gaining, what I had left that might still require management. I drove forward, with the morning light coming through the windshield at an angle that made everything ahead of me very clear and very bright, and the road extended in the only direction I was moving. I want to step out of the story for a moment and talk to you directly. Not as someone with answers. I am 26 years old and I am still in the middle of figuring out what this experience has made me. And I think anyone who wraps something like this up with complete certainty is either further along than I am, or being slightly dishonest about the process. But I have been sitting with everything I have told you, and there are a few things I understand now that I did not have language for when this began, and I think they are worth saying plainly. Financial abuse inside families is a specific kind of harm. It is different from other forms of betrayal because of what it uses as its operating cover. It uses love. It uses the assumption, the deep, foundational, almost biological assumption that the people who raised you are not capable of viewing your future as a resource available for their own extraction. That assumption is not naive. It is the correct default for how families are supposed to function. The problem is that when a family operates differently, that assumption becomes the mechanism of the harm. You don't check the account because you trust them. You don't read the fine print because you trust them. You don't call the attorney at 18 because you are 18 and you have been told your whole life that this family takes care of its own, and you have not yet accumulated enough evidence to understand that its own was a category with conditions attached. The theft is never only money. I need to say that again because I think it is the thing most people miss when they hear a story like mine from the outside. The money is the record of something else. It is the documented proof of how you were valued relative to someone else inside the same family unit. When my parents withdrew $47,000 from an account established in my name and used it to fund my brother's wedding, they were not only committing a legal violation, they were producing, in financial form, the answer to a question I had been asking my whole life without knowing how to ask it directly. They told me, in transaction records, what all those years of smaller signals had been building toward. The money was the evidence. The inequality was the crime. And I want to speak for a moment to the people listening to this who have not had money taken from them, because I think there are more of you than there are people in my specific situation, and I think what happened to me is the extreme end of something that exists on a much longer spectrum. If you are the person in your family whose needs are consistently treated as negotiable, whose plans get interrupted without apology, whose milestones get acknowledged less, whose discomfort gets named as oversensitivity, I am not telling you that your family is going to steal from you. I am telling you that the dynamic is real, that your perception of it is almost certainly accurate, and that the fact that it has never been confirmed in writing does not make it less true. You are not imagining it. You have never been imagining it. The specific exhaustion of being the family member who is always asked to absorb and adjust and accommodate without equivalent consideration, that exhaustion is the symptom of something structural, not something personal. Name it to yourself, at minimum. That is not a small thing. At our final meeting, Patricia mentioned something Nadia had said during the trust setup, something Patricia had written down at the time, because it struck her as unusually precise. My grandmother had said, "The best thing a woman can do for the women who come after her is make sure the system cannot reach them." I have turned that sentence over many times since Patricia told it to me. What my grandmother left me was not a rescue. She did not swoop in and fix the situation while she was alive. She did not confront my parents or advocate loudly or draw visible lines of protection around me. What she did was quieter and more durable than any of that. She built something the system could not dismantle. She thought structurally, legally, across a timeline that extended past her own life, and she transferred to me, not just resources but methodology, the understanding that love, when it is serious, makes itself legally enforceable. I think about what it means to be the woman who comes after her. I think about what it means to carry that sentence forward. So here is what I want to leave you with, and I am not going to tell you what to do with it. That is genuinely not my place. But I want to ask you something worth sitting with. What are you quietly absorbing right now, in the name of keeping the peace? What future, what plan, what version of yourself have you allowed to be managed, adjusted, or quietly redirected by someone who never asked for your consent before doing it? It does not have to be money. It can be time, or opportunity, or the simple accumulation of always being the one who makes room. I am asking you to look at it clearly, not with anger necessarily, but with accuracy. Clarity is not the same as conflict. You can see something exactly as it is without immediately needing to do anything about it. But you cannot protect what you cannot see. My grandmother mailed me a handwritten note when I was 18. I have told you what it said. I have carried those words for 8 years, and I have understood them differently at different points in my life, as the sentence we return to most often tends to evolve in meaning as we do. Here is where I have landed, after everything. This is yours. Know what that means. It did not mean the account. It did not mean the money or the trust structure or the legal instrument or even the secondary account she had built in silence as a contingency against the worst of what she knew was possible. It meant my life. It meant this life you are living, this future you are building, this specific and irreplaceable personhood that has been undervalued in the room you grew up in that belongs to you. Not to the family narrative. Not to whoever benefits most from your smallness. Not to the system that was designed, consciously or not, to route your resources elsewhere. To you. Know what that means.